Good. Right. So thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to a very, very special edition of our EHU 19 virtual speaker series. I'm Laura Eastlake. I'm here with my co-directors, Andy and Bob, who will wave on cue. Thank you. And tonight we are welcoming three of our fantastic ECR and PhD researchers to talk to you about their research, to answer questions, and hopefully we'll have a really good conversation. Tying all their cool and interesting research ideas together, we also have a special guest host for this evening. Abby Hope, who will give us a wave, is a researcher on our MA in 19th century studies, which you can find out more about at this QR code or at the link. And just before I hand over to Andy and then Abby, make a note in your diaries to join us for our next event. We are welcoming Kayla Probian from Ohio State University to talk about the fantastically titled Wollstonecraft's Breasts, Breastfeeding, Maternity and Authorship in the 19th Century. So there's a future date for your diary on Thursday, the 25th of April. The QR code is being cut off the bottom of this, but you can go to our website and find it there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over quickly to Andy for tonight's safety briefing, which goes something like this.
Hello, everyone. My safety briefing is just about the fact that it's being recorded, so that messages that you put in the chat, I will get a record off at the end. And so you might want to think about what you say to each other, which you can do. If you want to talk to everyone, make sure that the little blue box in the chat function says everyone, or else you might just be talking to us. You can also ask specific questions at any time during the over the duration of all of the talks in the Q&A box, and that keeps them sort of separate so that we have a definite record of the questions and answers. So along the bottom of the screen, you should say participants, where you can see who's in the meeting chat, where you can tell us what the weather is like and where you're from. And then along a little bit, there's Q&A, and if you open up that Q&A box, and at any time you have a question during the talks, you can pop that in and we will get to them after we've heard all of our wonderful PhD students. So yeah, it's being recorded. Be careful what you say, and chat to us. But also, if you want to ask specific questions to anyone, you can pop them in the chat, and you can sort of say, you can help us by saying this one is for Julia, or this one is for Grace, or this one is for everyone. But any question we will get to in various ways. And as Bob was saying, we can promote you to ask your question if you have something that is more of a comment, and you want to sort of get our thoughts on that, for example. But that is my safety briefing. The exits are this way and that way. Over to Abby.
Thank you very much. Yeah, over to Abby for tonight's papers. I will stop sharing.
Hi, so welcome and thank you for coming. Andy completely stole my introduction, so I'm just gonna try and cut this as short as possible. So the format of how this next hour-ish is gonna go is we're gonna have three papers presented by PhD students, postgrad students who are studying at the Edgehill Centre for 19th Century Studies. I think Andy did put a link to the website in the chat if you want to read any more information about that. And yeah, like I said, if you want to ask any questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom, like Andy said, and we will come to all those after the three presentations have been completed. So first, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Grace Marks, who is a second-year PhD researcher working on friendships and readership communities built and maintained at a distance in the 19th century. Grace.
Oh, thank you very much, Abby. I'll just share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint, and I'll make that full screen. So yes, I'll set my time going. So my presentation is called Don't Forget About the Women and Children, because I want to reintroduce these marginalised readers back into the history of this newspaper. So the one that I'm looking at is called Ali Sloper's Half Holiday. It is a very weird and wonderful newspaper from the late 19th century. So this edition of this version of the Half Holiday runs from 1884 to around 1916, but iterations of Ali Sloper exist before and after these dates. So it had an average circulation of 340,000 weekly, so it was a hugely popular paper. And it featured Ali Sloper, this rather gangly fellow that you can see in the centre of the screen, and his friends and family getting up to various comic mischief in the paper. So you can see an example on the right of the screen of a front cover of the Half Holiday, featuring Sloper's just chaos. It's all chaos. There's not much historiography about this paper, but those that exist do tend to argue that it's a young working class man's paper. And I really question whether this is true. I think this is a very generalized assumption about the readership, because there is actually a lot of data about the real readers that can be found in the paper itself. So Ali Sloper's Half Holiday had two main competitions, the Pocket Watch competition and the Sloper Presents competition. And the Pocket Watch competition was really the big one. So it gave away 20 pocket watches, branded pocket watches, as you can see on the screen, and as I have found earlier, they gave away 20 of these pocket watches each week for 255 weeks. So that between 1886 and 1891. So that is 5,100 pocket watches they gave away over the course of this competition, which means there is 5,100 real readers that can be found in this paper. And as you can see, we've got names, we've got ages, we've got occupations, we've got locations. So this makes it traceable in genealogy websites such as Find My Past. So my sample that I'm looking at specifically for this talk is 1886 to 1880, so the statistics come from those years, but the whole competition did run until 1891. And so women made up 13.5% of the pocket watch winners. And while this might seem slightly small, I think pocket watches were a traditionally masculine item, so it's important to consider that in the gender balance. But the readers would fill out a slip full of all this information that you can see that is printed in the paper. And from that, the paper itself had a huge demographical understanding of their readers. And so they knew there was enough female readers to launch that second main competition, the Sloper Presents competition, where 50% of the winners were women. So by design, this competition is actively including female readers by specifically giving one asked for present to one lady and one gentleman per week. And you can see at the bottom, I've got an example that Lizzie Slight, this is my favourite one, asked for a live monkey. And I'd love to know the details of how the logistics of how that happened. And Howard Paul, bless him, asked for a rather less ambitious pair of hairbrushes. So it really was open to anything, but this competition again was designed to actively include women. And the Jubilee, Victoria's Jubilee celebrations, part of that, the paper gave away 10,000 Jubilee purses. So if pocket watches are traditionally masculine item, purses are traditionally feminine. So the fact that there's 10,000 being given away speaks to the volume of female readerships that the paper knows it has. And there's also Tootsie's matrimonial agency. So Tootsie is Ali Sloper's daughter. You can see her on the right of the screen. And these fashion fancies were kind of a spoof of the traditional middle-class fashion plates. And the matrimonial agency was basically Victorian Tinder, where you have dating columns and dating adverts. And the breakdown of that tends to be 4 women to 2 men published each week. So again, we've got more women in this space. Children as well were a very significant demographic. So 27% of the pocket watch winners were under the age of 19. So that's 662 of the sampled winners so far. But beyond the Half Holiday, we also have a children's book called The True Story of Ali Sloper and the Paint Pot, which I also have here. And this is a beautifully illustrated children's rhyming story focused on Sloper's twins pouring paint into his hat, which is a very trademark thing for Sloper. So we've got this like beautiful like iteration of Sloper that is specifically targeted at children, which again hasn't been considered in historiography so far. So the wider implications of my conclusions then is that I'm taking a reader-centered approach to this newspaper community, and because I'm looking at the real evidence of readers that can be found in the paper, we can draw more nuanced and accurate understandings of the readership, and really challenge that idea of it's just a working class men's paper. And I also just don't have time to talk about the class and the geographic diversity, but this map is from the Slope of Presence competition. You can really see how widespread the readers are across the country. But this isn't just relevant to Ali Sloper, so newspaper competitions, correspondence columns, letters to editors, matrimonial adverts can be found in other papers too, so there is there's evidence of real readers across papers, not just Ali Sloper. So yeah, don't forget about the women and children, include them in your research, and I really want to highlight those historically marginalised demographics, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grace. So on to our second speaker. It's Bianca Friedman, whose research interests from film theory, critical animal studies, and queer theories. Bianca began a PhD in 2021, researching and analysing the horse character's point of view in cinema. Over to you.
Thank you, Abby. I'll be sharing my screen in a second. Comes to make it bigger. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for all of you for being here. The draft title of my thesis at the moment is The Construction of Horse Point of View, Strategies and Implications of Film Representation of Horse Characters. My main research question is, what are the aesthetic, theoretical, and material implications of the representation of horse point of view? In the paradoxical situation in which humans cannot fully access any animal point of view, but keep representing it through media, the application of human categories to animals is inevitable. This makes representations both resources and devices of power. Therefore, my analysis is driven by secondary questions about techniques, narratives, impact of representations, and anthropomorphism. Moreover, my analysis includes a discussion of horse acting, let's say, a consideration of human-horse interactions on sets, and a problematization of how horses are treated and talked about in film industry. I focus on films in which horses are protagonists, and the selection was conducted by asking, does the film give an account of what it means to be a horse? Does the film focus on horses' personal and emotional experiences? I have considered live-action films from the global north released after World War II. And since I noticed that many of them were adaptations, I narrowed down my corpus to adaptations only. While operating within the broader field of cultural studies, my methodologies include human animal and critical animal studies, film analysis, and adaptation studies. Thinking about the aesthetic, theoretical, and material consequences allows us to think about a human's construction of what is alien, and about the power relationships that lie beneath the aesthetic process. Notions of animal agency and labor have been explored in a broad sense and should be narrowed down to species-specific focus. So my research addresses these subfields at the juncture with film and adaptation studies. As there are few studies on horse point of view in films, my research contributes to this understudied topic. Moreover, there seems to be little research combining animal studies and adaptation studies, so I intend to address this gap in literature. My research looks at both sides of the representation, thus considering meaning construction processes and the presence of real horses. And I also propose to look at anthropomorphism as a narrative and aesthetic category that is both culturally influenced and diversified between texts and within a single text. My main idea is that representing horse point of view is a multifaceted and multi-layered creative process with contradictory features and potentials. And now some brief considerations on Black Beauty, which is more in line with 19th century. The novel's success has inspired a great number of adaptations and other horse stories. Therefore, a chapter in my thesis is dedicated to this text and 3 film adaptations that are in line with my selection questions. The novel uses an internal focalization and a first-person narrative to tell the story of a horse in the industrialized late 19th century Britain. The process of attributing a humanly understandable voice to a horse is the way in which a dialectic of defamiliarization and empathy can be achieved. The novel's imaginative insights in horse perspective also had a material impact, as shown by the reduction of the use of the bearing rein, which is a part of the horse tack used to force horses head high and described in the novel as very painful. While some scholars underline that the bearing rein has never really been banned, they also point out that its use became less common after the novel came out. However, the imposition of a language and categories not belonging to animals poses challenges and risks. The novel creates polarized narratives about horses, I argue. Black Beauty is constructed as a collaborative horse eager to serve humans, while Ginger is as a resisting mare opposing to human suppression. Spoiler alert, since Black Beauty survives, unlike his friend Ginger, the novel keeps underpinning the contextual understanding of horses as serving in the industrial society. My analysis shows that the construction of horse characters and narratives as either collaborative or resisting are recurring in Black Beauty film adaptations and other stories. In the rest of the thesis as it stands right now, I refer to recurring polarized narratives that, I argue, are indicative of how humans tend to relate to animals and horses in particular. So this is me for today. These are the references that I used for my presentation, but most of all, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bianca. I'd just like to remind everyone you don't have to wait until the end to put your questions into the Q&A. You are more than welcome to type them up as we go through, just so we've got a bank built up for the end. So on to our third and final speaker for tonight. So having taught classics for 25 years, Julia Clayton is now a PhD creative writing student studying invented artworks in fiction. So I'll pass over to Julia.
Okay. Right, is that working?
Yes, you can see
Yeah,
it.
we can see it. Yeah.
Right, okay, so this evening I'd like to share with you some of my doctoral research, which, as Abby says, is on fictional artworks. And just to clarify what I mean by that, that's artworks which are purely the product of an author's imagination, which have no existence outside the text of a novel, such as Basil Hallward's portrait of Dorian Gray. And here we've got the before and after Dorian Gray's from the 1945 film version. But tonight, I'm going to focus on the treatment of art forgery in fiction and how fiction might give us an insight into what makes a successful forgery. Now, at this point, you might very well say, you know, if you want to discuss art forgery, why not just stick to real life examples? But there is a problem with that, which is that if we only look at art forgery through real life examples, that inevitably limits us to discussing failed examples of art forgery, the ones which were eventually exposed as forgery. Whereas the paradox of art forgery is that if it's successful, we never find out about it. So my argument is that art fiction actually helps us to imagine scenarios under which forgeries might pass undetected. So what I'm going to look at is 3 reasons why a forgery might succeed with some fictional and real life examples, and then 3 reasons why a forgery might be detected. So firstly, forgeries might succeed because they exploit gaps in art history, creating something that curators or collectors are actively looking for. And in a real life example, the Dutch forger Han van Meegeren read an awful lot of papers by experts on Vermeer And he noticed that a lot of them said there's a period of 10 years in Vermeer's life that we don't really know anything about. We think he went to Italy. We think he looked at a lot of paintings by Caravaggio, and we think he probably painted a lot of religious subjects. So the art historians said, we would expect more paintings to come to light by Vermeer that are on religious subjects and that show the influence of Caravaggio. So what Van Meegeren did was he painted one. He forged a Vermeer, the Supper at Emmaus, on a subject also painted by Caravaggio. And it was really easy to get art historians to authenticate it, precisely because it matched their own expectations. Now, a very specific way of filling gaps in art history is to forge a lost painting. And there you're fulfilling art historians' hopes that the painting might one day come to light. And in Peter Carey's novel Theft, the forger Michael Boone recreates a painting called Le Golem Électrique, which is a missing masterpiece by a fictional cubist painter called Jacques Leibowitz. And as there are no photographs of the painting, he's forced to rely on what he knows about Leibowitz's style, plus written descriptions of the painting by Leibowitz's friends, including Picasso. Now, this brings us to the second reason why forgeries might succeed, which is the idea of exploiting an artist's legacy. Because in Theft, Jack Leibowitz's widow not only inherits 50 unfinished canvases from his studio, but she also inherits the right to say whether a painting is an authentic Leibowitz or not. So what she does is she finishes the unfinished works and drip feeds them onto the market, dating them from the most sought after period of Leibowitz's work. Now, some of you, before we started the webinar, were talking about Patricia Highsmith's Ripley, Tom Ripley. And Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books, there are actually 5 of them collectively known as the Ripleyad, also explore how an artist's legacy might be exploited after their death. In Ripley Underground, the artist Philip Derwatt drowns off the coast of a Greek island and his body is never found. But Tom Ripley comes up with the story that Derwatt is still alive, but he's living as a recluse in a remote Mexican village. But he still manages to send, a crate of paintings over to London every year or so. And in reality, the new Derwatts, including this painting, The Clock, are being painted by one of Derwatt's old friends. The final reason I want to look at as to why forgeries might succeed is the idea that forgeries can authenticate each other. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but sometimes the more forgeries there are of a particular artist, the more they get accepted. And in Ripley Underground, we're told that 60% of the paintings attributed to Derwatt are forgeries. And the sheer number of forgeries means that each new forgery that appears on the market isn't just being judged against the painter's genuine works, but they're being judged against the forgeries that have already been accepted, which we might think of as enlarging the precedent class, if you like. And we can see the same thing happening in real life. Even though Han van Meegeren's later paintings, like Christ with the Woman Taken in Adultery, were really awful, and I don't think were a patch on the Supper at Emmaus, which I actually quite like, they were accepted as genuine because they were being compared not only with genuine Vermeers, but with the genuine Vermeers plus the Supper at Emmaus. So to finish off with, I'd like to look at 3 reasons why forgeries might be detected. And the first one is using the wrong materials for the period or for that specific artist. Now, usually we might think of this as being, a forger who makes the mistake of using a synthetic color like, say, titanium white to forge an 18th century painting. But Patricia Highsmith, who was an artist herself and who knew a lot of artists, did something much more subtle than this. Her novel Ripley Underground is based on an observation she made that once an artist has stopped using a particular pigment, they never go back to it. So in the novel, we're told that in 1954, Philip Derwatt stopped using cobalt violet as his default shade of purple, and he switched to a mixture of cadmium red and ultramarine. But what happens in the novel is that an American collector, Thomas Murchison, notices that some of the paintings that are being sold with a date of 1954 or later, like the clock, are still using cobalt violet. And the forger's use of the wrong purple is such a serious mistake that Tom Ripley has to kill Murchison. Otherwise, the entire Derwatt forgery scheme is going to unravel. A second reason why forgeries can be exposed is through anachronisms in style. And in Oscar Wilde's story, The Portrait of Mr. W.H., a character forges a portrait of an Elizabethan boy actor called Willie Hughes, because he's trying to prove his theory that Willie Hughes was the person that Shakespeare dedicated his sonnets to. So he actually employs a painter to paint him an Elizabethan style painting. But one of the reasons why the portrait is exposed as a forgery is that the style is too early. It's in the style of Francois Clouet, who was an artist from the generation before Shakespeare. So it's actually slightly out of kilter for the period. Finally, a reason why forgeries are exposed is because of anachronisms in content. Even fashions in faces change. When the Courtauld Gallery acquired this painting, The Madonna of the Veil, which was attributed to Sandro Botticelli, one critic noticed that the Virgin Mary looked remarkably like Lillian Gish, the silent movie star, and that led to it being unmasked as a forgery from the 1920s. And it's often said that forgeries sort of carry the stamp of the forger's own time. And I think Nick Broom's comment at the bottom there is really interesting, that an exposed forgery is really a peephole into the history of taste. Fictional forgeries can also come unstuck because of this type of anachronism in content. And my favourite example of this type of mistake comes from Robertson Davis's novel, What's Bred in the Bone. And in the novel, a forger called Letpfennig initially fools the experts with a painting called The Harrowing of Hell, which is attributed to the 15th century artist Hubertus van Eyck. But a sharp-eyed art historian notices that the monkey climbing on the gates of hell is a capuchin monkey, a New World monkey, which would have been completely unknown in Northwest Europe in the 15th century. Whereas 15th century Dutch painters, if they wanted to paint a monkey, they painted a rhesus macaque, like you've got on the screen there. So to sum up then, if you like, my argument is that fiction about art forgery enables us to explore art forgery from a different direction. Rather than looking at forgeries which failed, we can look at why forgeries might pass undetected. And I think in the process that might perhaps encourage us to take a more critical approach to the art we see displayed in museums and galleries, because perhaps a lot more of those are forgeries than we actually realise. So, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. All three of your presentations were amazing. I'm so excited to read them all. They're so crazily unique. I love them. Just before we head into the Q&A, some of you may have noticed what Laura Eastlake has said in the chat. We did have a advertised fourth speaker, Emma, who is unfortunately not able to be with us as she's not well. She will hopefully be attending a future event, but we definitely wish her well and hope that she's okay. So as we go into the Q&A, I can't see everyone, so I'm not sure if everybody already has their cameras on. But if you don't, speakers, can you please turn your cameras on? We had a first question in the Q&A from Roy for Grace, who says, do you think Tootsie Sloper might have been a role model for female readers? She seems less chaotic than the rest of the family.
Yes, shortly, I do. I think she is as important as Ali Sloper, even though it's his name on the title of the story, the paper. You always see these big illustrations as in the front cover that you saw on the slide. There's always a little caption that's written from Tootsie. So Sloper's antics and the mischief of the family is always filtered through Tootsie Sloper. So I think she plays such an important role, and especially for female readers, you know, you've got this man advertising the paper, it's his name on the paper, it's his brand essentially, but she still serves as the secondary important character. So yeah, I think she's really important, and especially the matrimonial agency is very caring. It's like she's looking after the people writing into this matrimonial agency. So it's her matrimonial agency, it's her fashion fancies. And I think she does embody that female role model in the same way Ali Sloper embodies a role model in a slightly different sense. So yeah, I think she's a very important character, and I think she's especially important for female readers as well. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question, but I'm not entirely sure who it's directed at, from Alison Brown. I don't know, Alison, if you can specify in chat if it's for everybody or if it's for one specific person.
You can turn your mic on as well, Alison, if you'd rather ask it live.
Yeah. For all. Okay, cool. Thank you. So Alison asks, is microanalysis so much more interesting than constructing meta-narratives? Can we have one without the other? For everyone.
Nobody wants to go first, do they?
That's a big question. Alison, are you okay for us to switch your mic on, and you can there we go, you can ask it if you're happy to. If we've put you on the spot though, and you can't, don't worry.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes. Hi.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's just I'm a fan of micro analysis, I've got to say, as a historian. And I think all three of the papers are very quite closely analysed, quite meticulous. Some who are less fond of microanalysis might say narrow. Yeah. But there's a lot of this kind of, it's a very popular approach at the moment, certainly in my own field, crime history. There's a lot of micro studies going on, and a lot of kind of borrowing from other what I've been seen as kind of slightly different disciplines like genealogy. So I think it's fascinating, and all three take that kind of meticulous and micro approach. Where does that leave us for the big stories? Okay, that's my question.
Thanks, Alison.
I can start if you'd like. So I do, it's kind of a mix of micro and macro, because 5,100 people is a lot of people. And that's just one competition. So there's multiple throughout the paper, and then there's the correspondence columns, and there's the letters to editors and the matrimonial agent. There's so many different places where readers crop up. So trying to focus on them all is difficult. But the reason I honed in on the pocket watch competition was because it gave the most information. So we've got, specifically it's asking for names, addresses, occupations, and how long they've been subscribing to the paper. So building that picture of really detailed analysis of the readers helps the wider picture of who's reading this paper, who is it produced for, because the publishers of the paper are getting all these thousands of slips, so they know who they're writing this paper for. So I think it's important to not generalize the readership as just a working class men's paper when it wasn't. And I think that doing that macro analysis really helps the wider narrative of why this paper is so successful and who is reading it. So I hope that answers your question.
if I can follow as a second speaker. Well, I must say that, I mean, I must confess that the time gap that I'm considering is quite broad. So in terms of macro, I would say I'm more macro versus micro. I'm more in the spectrum of a wider look at, and from the global north. I mean, it's huge. It's potentially huge, and especially considering that horses are pretty much everywhere in terms of films. So in order to like make my corpus a bit more manageable, I had to narrow down to those texts that specifically look or problematize, revolve on, say that, or represent in general horses' point of view, which is quite surprising. But a film that is called, don't know, Seabiscuit doesn't really talk about Seabiscuit or what his experience was, but more about the people that were exploiting him and riding him, or all the people involved in the business, etc., etc. Another thing is that looking at animal agency is very broad in the sense that it has been addressed as a very, very vague concept. And scholars are now quite keen on narrowing down this to a specific focus, as I mentioned, because an agency of a horse is different from an agency of a dog, or different from a fish, etc., etc. And fortunately, there are some contributions on horse agency and horse labor, and same discourse is valid for labor as well. And the thing is that even when we consider horse agency or horse labor, we kind of need to talk about horse agencies and horse labors, let's say, because there are different horse breeds. They're pretty much everywhere in the world, different, used for, unfortunately, exploited for different purposes. They can be wild animals, they can be considered pet therapists, athletes, unfortunately in some societies, also livestock, etc., etc. So in terms of narrowing down, especially by assuming an animal studies perspective, both human animal and especially critical animal studies perspective, it was more than you to narrow down as much as possible to one species. But of course, even narrowing down to one species, it raises conundrums and very many problems. And I try to refer to that in my last chapter in my thesis, where I talk about the actual horse individuals that were used in film productions for their different features and abilities and skills. So I hope that answers your question, which is very, very relevant. Thank you very much for raising it.
Okay, shall I go last then? Yeah, I suppose I don't really see what I'm doing as a micro-analysis. In fact, in many ways, I really wanted to move away from that. I wanted to move away from the idea of kind of focusing on one single short story, and instead look at a much wider range of text to try and look for patterns and trends. So, for example, I'm covering a period of 150 years. I think the earliest text I've looked at is a Henry James story from 1874, and the latest ones were novels published last year. And I have even managed to get the Iliad and the Aeneid in there as well somewhere. I've just hit my 100th piece of art fiction. Just finished reading my 100th piece of art fiction, although they haven't all found their way into the thesis. But I suppose I feel that by trying to read as much art fiction as possible, for example, I have been able to put the story by Oscar Wilde, The Portrait of Mr. W.H. Most discussions of that focus more on the kind of literary theory that the forger's trying to prove, whereas actually, if you look at it as a story about art forgery, and spinning a tale. It actually, that puts a different perspective on it. And for example, by reading an awful lot of recent art novels, I've managed to establish a trend, for example, that there's been a whole set of novels about women's art being misattributed to men. And I think what we can see happening there is that academic research trends that sort of really took off in the sort of 70s and 80s with Linda Nocklin's paper, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? People that, I mean, she actually didn't mean that entirely seriously, but people have gone ahead and tried to prove, I found a great woman artist from the past. And one of the arguments people have come up with subsequently is that there were great women artists, but their work has been overlooked because it was misattributed to a male relative or a male tutor or contemporary. And what I think is interesting, that you can see that academic research that was really getting going in the sort of 80s and 90s, that's now filtering down into popular novels being produced from around 2010 and so on.
Thank you. So the next two questions we've got are relatively similar, so I'm going to blend them together. So both Lorna and Cara asked, how did people get to their topics? Cara specifically is curious about Bianca, so shall we start with you, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I won't bother you with the long story of my PhD proposal journey because it's been long, let's say, not to say anything else. But it really, I mean, it originates mainly from my passion for horses. I'm a horsey person. I've been with horses since my early days, and I love cinema. I've studied comparative literatures, and then I moved on to strong interest for films. And I basically wanted to blend my passions together, and I thought it was a good idea, to spend as much time as I could on the things that I love. And fortunately, here at Jill, there's a beautiful center of studies, the Center for Human Animal Studies, where I can work really well and where my research can thrive. So I don't know if that's too simple for an answer, but this is where my research focus comes from, and then has obviously changed since the first proposal that I submitted. And but this, I guess, it's not a routine in the process of developing a research, I guess.
Shall I go next on that one then? So what I wanted to do was I wanted to try and come up with a topic which combined art history, creative writing and classics. Because one of the things I'm looking at is invented pieces of classical art or classical reception in invented art. And I think that Edge Hill actually is somewhere where that kind of interdisciplinary type of approach is really supported. Like, I know people at other universities who've said that, the lecturers have an apoplectic attack when it was suggested that they might do anything quite so sort of cross-disciplinary. So I think Edge Hill works very well for that. In terms of more specifically how I got there, I did the MA course in creative writing a couple of years ago. And I found that a lot of the work I was producing was very much on the theme of authenticity, things like forgery, reality, replicas. I've always been interested in replicas, largely because I love cast galleries. I love the idea that they're plaster replicas of Roman statues, which are replicas of lost Greek bronze statues and things like that. So essentially, I felt fictional artworks offered a really good opportunity to explore those kind of issues of authenticity. including, I mean, going back to the pictures I showed you of the two paintings of Dorian Gray. I mean, I said at the beginning that I'm looking at artworks that don't exist outside the pages of novels, but actually that's not true. The final chapter of my thesis is actually about how some of these fictional artworks have taken on tangible form, where replicas of them have had to be made for things like film and TV. But actually that goes back right to the ancient world, that idea of, oh, you know, and in the 19th century, you got people trying to make Pygmalion sculpture or make Achilles' shield or things like that. So yes, it was that aspect that really interested me originally.
Can I just jump in here at this point to say, as part of her PhD, Julia's also written a fantastic novel about invented art, which features cast galleries. And so if you haven't already come across, hopefully you'll see that in the future, but if you haven't already Googled Julia and found her creative writing and some of her articles as well, then you should absolutely go and do that. I hope you don't mind me giving you that little plug there, Julia. I'll pass over to Grace.
My short answer is blame Bob. Because in the third year I did Bob's special subject, which was all about the history of journalism, and he introduced the class, but also me, to Ali Sloper's Half Holiday. And then I found the newspaper competitions and I was just obsessed, instantly obsessed. And then I did my long essay on newspaper competitions, and I found that nobody had written about them. There was very, very little historiography generally about newspaper competitions, but they took up such a central part of Ali Sloper specifically. So that list of 20 winners that I showed you, it takes up the majority of the third page of the newspaper for 5 years. And the fact that they're so significant, but not anybody had written about it, I was like, oh, maybe I could do it. And yeah, the more I looked into it, the more, again, I just became obsessed, to the point that I've got 2 of the actual pocket watches, and I have an Ali Sloper book that even the British Library do not have. It's safe to say that my past birthdays have all featured Ali Sloper in some way. So I think it comes back to what Bianca said about fueling that passion. So I did the MA in 19th century studies, and during the course of that, the lovely lecturers came up and said, oh, there's a guaranteed PhD, we've got a funded PhD, but it has to be about friendship. I was like, oh, well, Ali Sloper is the friend of man, I can shoehorn him into that, as well as the Eggshell archives. And then slowly Ali Sloper's just taken over and I'm only doing Ali Sloper now. So it was fitting the friendship and the friend of man into this PhD, and it just slowly taken over. But yeah, the more I researched it, the more I realized nobody else has been doing this, and I just love it. I really do. So yeah, that's how I kind of got started with all that.
Fantastic. I wonder, oh, Andy.
I was gonna ask my question, which we semi-agreed beforehand, but which I will preface by saying thank you to the 3 speakers for doing such lovely lightning talks. I have a low attention span, so I particularly appreciate the speedy flash talk. But we know that in a flash talk, there's stuff that you have to cut out. And my question to the 3 wonderful presenters is, like, I guess part of it is there anything that you had to cut out that you would really like to talk about now, or if you were so perfectly organized that you just did the crystalline version of your research in that 5 minutes and you're perfectly happy with it, is there an element of your research that you haven't talked about that you'd like to blow our minds with now? That's essentially it. So it's basically an excuse to talk more about your research interest, which sort of flows nicely from what got you into your research. Give us a magic nugget from your research that you haven't told us about yet. Maybe Julia, you haven't started. You've always either come at the end or come in the middle. I'll pick on you.
Okay, yeah, I have got a nugget I'd like to share with you, because one of my arguments in my thesis is that art history is already a form of fiction. Even before novelists get their hands on it, it's already subjective. And there is an absolutely fabulous story relating to this, which is that in the early 20th century, the art historian Bernard Berenson, who at the time was seen as the man when it came to connoisseurship, now his reputation has declined a bit, but he was seen as the big cheese of art historians. He was studying 15th century paintings by Botticelli and by Filippino Lippi. And he reckoned there was a third group of paintings that looked a bit like their work, but which he didn't think was by either of them. And he actually came up with an artist. He effectively invented an artist. He said, there's this group of paintings I can't attribute to a known artist. So I think they're by one of Botticelli's friends, who I'm going to call Amico di Sandro. And the bizarre, he wrote an essay on this chap, and he even started to speculate on his personality. He said he's a bit kind of free and easy compared to Botticelli. He improvises a bit more, you know. And the extraordinary thing was that this made-up artist begins to appear in things like guidebooks to Florence, where visitors are told, you know, if you're going to the Uffizi, you can see this painting by Amico di Sandro. And the whole thing was a complete fabrication. But all those paintings that he attributed to Amico di Sandro have now either been reattributed to Botticelli or to Lippi. But the thing I love most about the whole thing is that Baron Corvo, Frederick Rolfe, actually wrote a novel about Amico di Sandro. So this a painter who an art historian had invented actually became the basis for a historical novel. So I think that's really cool.
Grace, do you want to go next? Bianca's offering you the stage.
Thank you. If I could very cheekily share my screen again. This is what I didn't get to talk about. It's the occupations and the class base of the paper. So this is my fancy chart. So very briefly, his class categorizes historical occupations. So 1 is your high society, 12 is your farm laborers, your unskilled workers. So the biggest column is 9, which is lower skilled workers. So it's mainly laborers, blacksmiths, things like that. But then 4 and 5 are your firmly middle classes. So you've got clerks, you've got I'm trying to think of them off the top of my head now. Teachers are in there. There's all sorts of other middle class occupations that are medium and highly skilled. So we've got a significant number of middle class readers, a very large portion of them categorized by his class. So again, this working class male paper isn't necessarily reflected in the readership information we have in the half holidays competitions. So it's like working class young men absolutely read the paper. I'm not denying that. It's just they were not the only ones and they weren't the predominant demographic. So we've got a lot of middle class, a lot of women, a lot of children reading the paper as well. So that's the class base of the paper is something that I didn't quite manage to fit in, but is something I think is really interesting. So I will stop sharing and pass to Bianca.
Well, this is not fair. I don't have anything to share right now. So, but well, yes, I left many things out, many selected scenes that I have kind of analyzed throughout, because I'm looking at adaptations. So I'm focusing on the type of focalizations and how they are rendered in the film adaptation. But definitely something that I had to leave out for this talk is the last bit, which I was very scared about, but then I ended up being kind of proud of. So yes, the involvement and the exploitation of horses on film sets, which made me think about the type of the pieces of literature that I have been reading, and they are either focused on representation or on the exploitment of animals. And but I think they're very. I mean, there are some obviously some contributions that hint at the need to for a consideration of animals beyond representation, and because obviously, I mean, whether it is a beautiful, nice, and well rendered, whatever, or awfully anthropocentric and distorting representation. I mean, especially in the case of live actions, but obviously also for those CGI representations, etc. Horses are involved, and this has to be considered. And my last chapter kind of moves from a consideration of horse agency as a thing that it is important to acknowledge and understand as meaningful, but also as something that is talked about and obviously manipulated in the sense that animals are generally depicted as enjoying the thing that they're doing as stars, which is definitely not the case, especially when considering that there is a hugely undetectable amount of invisible labor that is going on, and people may not be able to understand, meaning trainers or filmmakers especially. So I'm analyzing a range of different things that came out from my archive / research online about, I mean, it's very difficult to find information that is reliable also when you're talking about animals, because there are people from the industry, which are a community, a cultural community in itself. So they're kind of molding information themselves about how the film has been done and how horses have been treated. And spoiler alert, unfortunately, when you see no animals were harmed in the making of this film, well, it is not always the case because the American Humane Society is not exactly, I mean, it's a very controversial kind of institution, and I can forward some very disturbing links about this very sad side of the filmmaking. So this is definitely something that I had to cut out because they have very little to do with the 19th century, definitely.
Thanks so much, Bianca. I wonder if I could be selfish here and claim a final comment rather than a question before I pass back to Abby to close. But just following on, Bianca, on your point there, your sort of bigger ethical point, we asked you to present these really small little 5-minute nuggets on your research. But I think what's come out for me more than anything tonight, and sort of following on your point there, and particularly at a time when arts and humanities nationally are facing challenges like we've never seen before, what struck me about your papers is the way that from these focused small research projects and these little 5-minute nuggets that you've given us, you've spoken across these papers to things like these big questions that we face today, from ethics, from animal rights, Grace thinking about, through the little lens of Ali Sloper, thinking about big questions about data cultures and social networks and friendships across, we've just come through a pandemic where friendships have had to be at distances and digital and happening through kind of fandoms and groups like that. And then with Julia, I mean, we're in an age of AI, right? We're thinking about these big questions about the processes and the ethics of reproducing art are more live again than they have been in generations. What fantastic spokespeople you are, and how important your research is for the big questions of today. So thank you very, very much for sharing that with us. Andy's cat has arrived, which means it is time to say hello to Wilbur, but also to hand back to Abby to close us out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm obsessed with that cat. If anybody had any questions that you didn't have a chance to ask or get answered, you are more than welcome to ask on social media. I'm just put in chat now the tag for EHU19 Feel free to, oh, me and Laura did it at the same time. Feel free to ask a question, we will get that answered for you. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thank you so much to everybody who came to listen and ask questions. A quick reminder that the next event for the 2019 series is taking place on the 25th of April at 6 p.m. and is a talk entitled Wollstonecraft Breasts. If you're as curious as I am about that, the booking link is on the 2019 website and also on the social medias. So thank you so much again to everybody, speakers and audience, and good night.
Next one. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'll finish recording.